If you think about it historically, most things didn't travel very far from their point of origin. Most people didn't travel very far from where they were born. Most products were made locally. A lot of information remained local. And what we're seeing now is that a lot of these things have become more mobile. People traveling the world, goods being made wherever it's most efficient, information traveling instantaneously around the globe. And it's gotten us to the point where so many things are born global. There used to be a time when companies could start in one place and conquer a local market and hone their skills. And at one point, you take the decision: we're going to expand internationally, and let's go to this market, let's go to that market. And increasingly, you're born global. Your products are available in many parts of the world. It's a tremendous opportunity for a lot of companies to get scale fairly quickly. But of course, it also poses lots of challenges. One thing that has certainly changed is there are hardly any parts of the world that aren't connected and that aren't plugged in, right? For a long time when we talked about globalization, it was really, some of the large emerging markets from Asia becoming connected into the global economy. But now all of Africa is connected. Most Latin American countries have integrated into the global economy. You look at the history of globalization, and the cost of moving things, physical objects, people, and information has fallen dramatically. But especially over the last 10 to 15 years, you're literally talking about the cost coming down to zero when it comes to information. So our ability to digitize things, not just communications, but even products and services, has dramatically increased. And the price of transmitting that has come down to zero. And sometimes you say, well, is this just a quantitative change or is it a qualitative change? But when you have the cost of global reach approaching zero for a whole lot of things, that is a qualitative change. Now you're born global, your products and services might be available everywhere. You're dealing with so many different social, political, regulatory, cultural environments. And so, that's hard, especially for sort of, young and quickly growing companies to have these competencies, the competencies that in the past, your GE or your, Ford or IBM would have. Now even startups need to be able to navigate some of these different social and political environments. But in addition, it's become so difficult to navigate stakeholder conflict. So you're satisfying stakeholder demands in one market, but you're creating stakeholder conflict in other markets because political systems haven't converged. Cultural expectations continue to be very different. And so as you're trying to deliver in one particular setting, you're creating new challenges for yourself elsewhere. IKEA, for example, which took images of women out of their catalogs when they produced the editions for Saudi Arabia, other parts of the Arab world, right? It seemed like a pretty sensible thing to comply with local rules and expectations. But of course, it created a big backlash back home in Sweden, right? One of the most progressive countries in the world. IKEA proudly wraps itself in the Swedish flag in terms of their colors. We teach this a lot. It's almost a cliche to say you got to think global and act local. Okay, but all of a sudden, by acting locally, adapting to stakeholder demands in a certain setting, you're creating problems for yourself in a different setting, right? So it isn't enough to think global and act locally. You got to think global, act local, but then also think about how acting locally is going to affect you somewhere else. So you're constantly moving back and forth between local and global. So stakeholder conflict is something that I don't think is going to go away, but I don't want to be negative about it because it creates all kinds of new opportunities for value creation, right? So it used to be the case that if you could figure out how to adapt your product to a local market in a way that ensured that you remain consistent in terms of your overall product attributes and your brand, you'd be successful. And I think the same is true when it comes to social and political issues. If you figure out how to work with different stakeholders without sacrificing your overall value and what you represent, that probably is a pretty important source of competitive advantage, right? So I think companies are going to thrive that have that sensitivity, that understand how parts of the world differ, that understand how millennials across countries might be having certain things in common, but at the same time appreciate the different context in which they're operating. And that means that diversity in your top management team becomes more important. You can't sit in one country and try to manage all of these issues around the world without these insights. And it isn't just about having in the local subsidiary people from that country, because at the end of the day, you need to bring these things together, you need to be consistent, you need to be credible. So having diverse teams, having diverse voices, really opening yourself up, connecting, those things I think are going to be incredibly important as you navigate this challenging terrain, and the companies that do it well are going to thrive, even in this complicated environment. That was the conventional wisdom, right? That as more and more countries embraced market systems, that we would see convergence in political systems, regulatory systems, even organizational structures. And we're not really seeing that. Clearly we're seeing the market being embraced in many parts of the world, but the way market systems work in the US and Scandinavia, in Southern Europe and in East Asia, for example, is completely different. And I think the same is true for organizations. So it's sort of a really interesting development where we have more connectivity, more transparency against the backdrop of continued diversity or continued divergence. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. Again, the companies, for example, that manage to navigate this terrain are going to do very well. The fact that we have divergence and diversity of approaches to regulation can be a source of innovation, for example, right? Who is going to deal with issues of medical privacy the best? What country has the best model to drive sustainability in its urban transport, for example? If we had convergence, we might be losing out on some of the opportunities to see experimentation and new ideas. And I think actually companies can play a very important role in supporting that kind of experimentation, looking for solutions, and then helping to get other countries to adopt some of the best outcomes. Goods and information move much more freely than people. I mean, we're seeing current crisis when it comes to immigration in Europe, as well as the debate over immigration here in the US, right? How difficult it is for people to move. So that's certainly, if you go back to your previous wave of globalization at the end of the 19th century, there was a lot more mobility of people than there is right now. The other one that you would point to is, misunderstanding. I mean, information travels freely, but that doesn't mean that people are necessarily seeing and interpreting the same thing. I mean, it's sort of remarkable that we've had this massive increase in the amount of information, but that doesn't mean that people know more, understand one another better. So one of the things that we have to figure out is how to actually get people to benefit from that information, to sort that information, to know what to look at. And I think that means that despite the fact that we're all connected and there's more information available, doesn't mean that we've automatically come together as a global community, right? That information can be used to divide people as opposed to bringing them together. So I think these kinds of things will continue to be obstacles when it comes to sort of real integration.